I turn now to my studio guest. I'm joined by Tessa Dunlop, an historian, author of Army Girls, The Secrets and Stories from the Final Few Women Who Served in World War II, and Alex Deane, who is a political commentator and author of Lessons from History. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Were you today thinking about some of those women that you brought to life in your most recent book?
Interestingly, I went and did a sleepover with one of them, who is still very much with us, 100-year-old Betty Webb, who I know you know.
I know her because I've interviewed her. What a marvellous woman she is.
And she thinks the same of you, Mark.
Well, that's...
Sends her regards this morning. She's sorry she couldn't join us on the phone, but she's doing her own wreath laying in Withell. And I found her particularly helpful in terms of steering me and other people through this period where sometimes it's hard.
I'm so sorry, we've got a problem with your mic. We'll fix that. Alex, what were your thoughts today?
Well, my thoughts at Remembrance tend to be about the fallen, of course, and think about my family. And my mother's mother got divorced and remarried, so I had 3 grandfathers, and all my grandfathers served. And I think about that generation. Luckily for me, and for them, of course, they lived, and therefore I did. And I think about all those who didn't enjoy such fortune, and all those of my generation who are not here today because they lost, their ancestors didn't have the good fortune that mine did.
Well, have you written about some of these matters?
I have, but things changed for me. You were asking Cameron about whether he thought this Remembrance service was different. This is the first, because of that background that I've described to you, I've always felt very passionately positive about Remembrance services and Remembrance Sunday. This is the first weekend I haven't. Because of the protests that we saw, and because of the tensions I felt were very live in our country. I thought that this episode has revealed, whichever side you are on Israel, Palestine and so forth, I thought that this episode has revealed some real tensions in our country we may have turned a blind eye to until recently. And I haven't written about that yet, but I will.
In a pessimistic way, do you feel that these are difficult to resolve, these tensions?
I do feel pessimistic about it, not least because people of all backgrounds and faiths in our country have had great respect for what this Remembrance Sunday and Remembrance Day have meant. Whether you're of Sikh background, or you had connection to the Gurkhas, or your family was one of the many, many Indian families that had people who laid down their lives against the Nazis. We had a sense of commonality and respect for what this meant. And I certainly think yesterday, the one thing I'll say in defence of the people who went on their march yesterday is it's not their fault this coinciding happened of Remembrance Day and Remembrance Sunday. They should have had the good sense to call it off. They should have had the good sense to say, we believe in peace, that's what we want, therefore we're not going to march separately today, we'll join in Remembrance Day. I think that would have been a powerful message. But the point I'm making is there was clearly a good chunk of people in this country who just didn't care that it was Remembrance Day yesterday.
Tessa, I'm so sorry about what happened a moment ago. Apparently your microphone wasn't working, but it should be now. Let's start from the beginning. You were talking to Betty Webb, who is 100 years old.
Yes.
And you're in touch with her still. She's laying a wreath today, which is quite extraordinary. Yeah. Tell us about Betty and use that to illustrate the women that you were writing about.
Well, I was interested particularly by Betty this year. She's, I think, almost as old as the cenotaph itself. She's absolutely got her wits about her, and she says she always uses that 2-minute silence to count her blessings because she didn't lose key players of her family, either in the First World War, which she was born just after, or indeed in the Second World War when she served at Bletchley Park, and in the Pentagon, actually, later on, until the end of the Pacific War. And I then asked her about the demonstrations and what she felt about this sort of idea of contamination that I think has been very much discussed in the press. And she was a bit confused, because I think it is quite confusing working out when the demonstrations were going to be. Was it going to interrupt the spectacular and appropriate service we've just seen? And when she kind of worked it all out, the sentiment was, I'd rather it didn't happen, but there was no question that it should be banned. And I then went and joined her with one of her friends from the Bromsgrove Conservative group, 92-year-old Jill. Again, would have rathered it hadn't happened, but a ban wasn't what they were calling for. And I found that helpful, that these were people who have kind of walked the walk. One was in boarding school during the war, the other served in the war. And no, it's not for them, it's of their generation. I mean, you would be amazed if they were sort of out there, you know, waving their banners. But at the same time, They understand what Britain's there for, what the Day of Remembrance. It's not obligatory. We don't all have to wear a poppy. If we did, it would become meaningless. We don't all have to observe the silence.
Tessa, let's step back one stage. Just to remind us about the sort of women that you were writing about and the sort of women who will have been in your mind today.
I spoke to a gerontologist, actually, because one of the criticisms, I wrote the Bletchley Girls as well, one of the criticisms by an acerbic reviewer in The Guardian was I used too many superlatives to describe the women. And I said to this gerontologist, but they are all remarkable. How can this be? It can't just be that, the sort of generalisations about a generation, because humanity doesn't work like that. And he said, what you're doing is you're talking to outliers who are still alive over the age of 90, 95 now, 100. He said, and to get there, with everything intact, yes, it requires great good luck, but actually it also requires extraordinary discipline. There is quite a lot of research done now about how you have to retain ambition, optimism, etc., to survive well enough to contribute to a book into extraordinary late old age. So it's not a coincidence that those outliers who I'm talking to really are remarkable. And just quickly, if we may, on today's service, and the importance of the royal family, Lady Martha Bruce, who died a year ago, hugely important, both during the war and then later for women in the later female service that came post-World War II. She was so eloquent on the importance of the royal family, having something to look up to. The military is hierarchical by definition. You need someone at the top. And she helped me understand, I'm a bit more liberal, she helped me understand why it was so vital that we have this extraordinary apolitical symbol. Look, almost everyone out there this morning, we've just seen Rishi, Sunak, Sadiq Khan, Keir Starmer, they've all been mudslinging in the papers, but there's the king, sombre in grey, someone who genuinely in this moment this morning is apolitical. We don't know what he's thinking. Thank goodness for that. We can just respect him.
OK, and let me just press you further again, to just take the story back another stage. Tell us about some of the work that those women were doing.
Yeah. I've got to say this, they gave birth, of course, to the baby boomers and the sort of protesters, but they were incredibly uncomplaining, these women. They were the first generation of women who in 82 years ago, were conscripted. There was no choice. They had to serve in some form by 1941, and they did so uncomplainingly, often equivalent jobs to men, because let's not pretend all men were on the front line, invariably paid at least a third less. A question of moaning? No, not a bit of it. That would come later, incidentally, for Betty Webb. In the 60s, working for the TA, she'd be writing about equal pay. But in World War II, and do you know, we didn't have a big feminist watershed at the end of World War II. But all of those women took away this extraordinary sense of independence they had, serving for their country, away from home, from the confines of their small homes, where the patriarch at the top of the table. This was a great and unforgettable moment, although it sounds ironic because it was in war.
Yes. Alex, as we return to very recent events, I think, to some extent people are saying today that Suella Braverman made a bad call. She was trying to get this march banned. Turns out there wasn't very much violence on the march. What violence there was, well, it's led to more arrests on the group that are known as far right than amongst those who are advocating justice for Palestine. It looks perhaps then as though the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police got his call right. On the other hand, it must be acknowledged that Suella Braverman had the support of opinion polls during last week when she was saying that it was inappropriate to hold this march. Can you make a political judgment as to how these players stand with the fallout?
I think so. First things first, she's perfectly entitled to express her view. I thought one of the strange things that happened across the political spectrum, people on her own side and within the opposition were saying somehow this was something a politician shouldn't comment on. And it took not very much Kremlinology for people to dig back and find that each of the people saying this from the Labour front bench and from amongst the Tories had done the same in the past, had given their criticisms of the police, had said the police should or shouldn't do that. And specifically, this was not a policy announcement that she was was breaching any kind of arrangement for, because the police has the decision about whether or not to say a march may not go ahead. Now, my view is actually different to hers. My view is that there is no reason for the march in law not to go ahead. I simply think they shouldn't have done. The fact you've got a right to do something doesn't mean you should.
So that's more a matter of taste than of the law.
Well, exactly. I might have the right to call you some names, but I don't. One, because I don't want to, but two, because I'm polite.
I thought it was quite bad taste, but I think you may have been a bit too fair to Suella Braverman there. I mean, she is the Home Secretary, and if she has an issue with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, with whom she obviously has a direct relationship, she can take that up with him. But what she did was she published in a newspaper the view that the police were biased. Now,
well, I wouldn't push that too much, because, of course, the binary option she's got is dismissal. And I wouldn't want to, that's a well you can only go to very infrequently, and I wouldn't want her to think about dismissal of the Commissioner on grounds
But are you saying
then
that it's a new part of our Constitution, that so that the Home Secretary doesn't find herself in a position of dismissing the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, what she does as an interim measure is publish an article in the Times saying that she thinks he's biased?
What else are you supposed to do when your message isn't getting through, and the Police and Crime Commissioner for the area concerned is Sadiq Khan, who has indicated he doesn't give a fig what the government of the day thinks. In fact, the more conflict he has with Westminster, the better. So what else are you supposed to do in her shoes? Now, she spoke for a considerable portion of this country when she put that position. And I would also make the point that basically when people take the numbers that you were just talking about, X many arrested on a counter-protest and X many arrested in the main demonstration, she had a point when she was saying the police might have been demonstrating policing unfairly. They've been sending since the march images of people dressed up in Hamas costumes and shouting not just from the river to the sea, but death to all Jews. And the police are now asking for help in trying to find those people.
Yes.
Didn't do anything on the day, whereas they felt the collar of each and every person who was on the other side of that equation. No, I find them equally repugnant, by the way.
But again, one might say that you have to allow the police some operational flexibility. They may have thought that it was tactically the wrong thing to do, to storm into the middle of a crowd to arrest people, when, at their leisure, they could arrest them over the following 48 hours. We were talking about...
Well, we'll see whether they do or not, whether that's going to be in the pudding, isn't it?
We will. But we were talking about good taste. And I would just say, all right, the Home Secretary can publish such an article, but do you think it's actually good taste? Do you think it's part of the Home Secretary's dignity to do that?
I think that there is not enough robust conservatism in modern politics, and when I see it, I welcome it.
Tessa, I heard you chuntering slightly during the course of that discussion.
Not distasteful.
No. What was your reaction to what we were discussing there?
Well, I live very near Vauxhall Bridge. It's a 15-minute cycle. So I went down on my bicycle, having been to visit my World War II veterans. I thought I need to, because it's very difficult, isn't it, finding a way through the quagmire on social media and indeed in some of our newspapers. So I went with a friend who doesn't think there should be a ceasefire in Palestine. I would like a ceasefire, so I'm going to be transparent about that. And it's important to always go with your other, I think. And we went to look to see how this march, I didn't see the counter demonstrations, only the pro-Palestine march. Several things struck me, and I also talked to a lot of police on the ground, as you can imagine. I just went up and had a chat. I was struck by, and so was he, individual I went with, how enormous it was. I stood there for over 40 minutes on the southern side of Vauxhall Bridge, and it didn't stop coming past. And both he and I reiterate that he comes from a different political side, it was overwhelmingly pretty sort of low-key. I thought there'd be far more sort of rabble-rousing. I did hear chants I would consider unsavoury, especially if I was Jewish, the river to the sea. I did hear that. I'd say a 5 to 10% of individuals on that march were taking part in those sort of chants, maybe 5%. One of the reasons why I wouldn't go on that march, incidentally, but I've got to say that overwhelmingly I didn't find it in any way challenging. I then asked serving police officers, and they said this is extraordinarily well behaved for a march of its size, but they had just rushed from the counter-protest. So they had only just arrived. And I said, well, who are the counter-protesters? And they said, quote unquote, I'm quoting them here, football hooligans without a football match. And I said, and what were they doing? And they said, having a go at us. And I said, talk to me about where you're at with the Home Secretary, to which they just rolled their eyes. So I thought that was more diplomatic, perhaps, than some of our politicians have been from men policing. They're predominantly men I was speaking to yesterday on the ground. Funnily
enough, I think I live even closer to Vauxhall Bridge Road than you do. And I need to, you won't be surprised to know that on a Saturday I need to go and see my tailor.
Yes,
naturally. And my tailor is
looking very good today, Michael.
My tailor is the other side of Vauxhall Bridge Road. So I went down there, and of course, there were, as you say, 300,000 people walking past. And I was quite surprised at this, I was able simply to cross the road in between them, obviously dodging them as they came through. I was also struck by the fact that the police had not lined the route.
No.
It was quite soft touch policing. I mean, they were there at the junctions because obviously traffic was being interrupted. I wasn't there as long as you. I didn't hear anything untoward. There seemed to be a generally pretty good mood.
Yeah.
Lots of people said, "Oh, you're Michael Portillo." I tried very much.
Did you get a boo or a clap or just an apathy? A shrug?
They simply pronounced my name. But what I wanted to make clear was that I wasn't on the march. I was walking the opposite direction. But did you feel it should have been held?
I don't think the two events were mutually exclusive. Remembrance is very important, but I think over the last 100 years, and Betty pointed this out to me, the nature of war has changed. We talk about the fallen, when we sent troops into battle. Indeed, some of our men we know and women died in Iraq and which 20 years ago this year, and in Afghanistan. But actually, so much of war is now conducted remotely that I think we also have to turn our attention to collateral damage. I hate that expression. Civilians, deaths, women, children. And I was struck by the numbers on that march yesterday who were women and children. There was a lot of children on the march. And I think we can hold both the fallen in our memories, and we can also recognise that today too many civilians are dying, not just in Gaza.